The sun had long surrendered to a thick shroud of clouds as Captain Lara Weiss walked across the wet concrete of Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. The tarmac, slick with a fine rain, reflected the gloomy twilight, crisscrossed with the iridescent sheen of oil spills like veins on tired skin. In this landscape of quiet resignation, one figure moved with a purpose that was a stark contradiction to the surrounding mood. Her sage-green flight suit clung to her body, a cold second skin. The zipper was pulled to her chin, a barrier against the damp and perhaps against the doubt that saturated the air. Her steps were firm, practiced, unhurried, a rhythm forged from discipline and countless hours in the sky. She wasn't here to impress, she was here to deliver. Operation Whiteout was dead. Officially declared a failure. 3 missions, 3 aborts. The Air Force's most advanced transport jets, C-17 Globemasters packed with digital avionics, automated landing systems and cutting-edge satellite communications, had all turned back. They were defeated not by an enemy but by the planet itself. A massive geomagnetic storm, an invisible hurricane of charged particles, had descended upon the Bering Sea. It swallowed radio signals, blinded GPS systems, and turned the sleek, glass cockpits into a cacophony of screaming alarms and flickering error messages. Lara had sat in on the final debrief, a silent observer in the back of the room. She had seen the faces of the young pilots upon their return, a mix of high-tech frustration and raw helplessness. "We were flying blind, Colonel," a young first lieutenant had reported, his voice still shaky. "The systems were in chaos. The autopilot was fighting us and navigation was a complete guessing game." The base commander, a general with a face like a topographical map, had listened, then made the only call he could. "The operation is scrubbed. That zone is now classified as unreachable. The risk to our crews and aircraft is unacceptable." The flight roster was cancelled. The file was closed. The small U.S. weather and communications outpost on a remote Aleutian island was, for all intents and purposes, on its own. A dozen souls, cut off from the world, with dwindling supplies of food, fuel and medicine. To the command staff they had become a statistical write-off. But Lara Weiss didn't think in statistics. To her they were colleagues. And waiting was not in her nature. Her path took her away from the modern, brightly lit hangars, towards an older, almost forgotten corner of the base. Hangar 12. A corrugated metal behemoth that smelled more like a museum than an active-duty station. A scent of old hydraulic fluid, cold steel and aviation fuel that had seeped into the concrete for decades. Inside, under the flickering glow of a few bare bulbs, sat her aircraft. A C-130 Hercules. Old analog, deafeningly loud. A relic from an era when pilots flew with their hands and their instincts, not with a mouse and a touchscreen. Her younger colleagues called it the flying dinosaur, or the old workhorse. Lara just called her Eleanor, named for her grandmother, a woman who had weathered the Great Depression and taught her that the most reliable tools are not always the newest, and that one can always find order in the midst of chaos if you know where to look. Without a word, she pulled the heavy ladder to the cockpit and climbed inside. The air was cool and still. She wiped a sleeve across the fogged-up glass of the analog gauges. The altimeter, the attitude indicator, the magnetic compass. No glowing screens, no digital maps. Just needles, dials, and switches that engaged with a satisfying, mechanical click. Her hands moved over the controls with a familiarity born from years of practice, not from a manual. No co-pilot, no digital assistant. Just her, a hand-drawn course chart on weatherproof paper, and a flight logbook whose edges were frayed from countless journeys. She put on her headset, the earpieces crackling softly. "J-Bear Tower, this is Weiss." Her voice was calm, almost casual. "No flight plan filed. Request for radio contact is negative. I'm going dark." Pause. Then the voice from the tower, young and nervous. It was a new airman, couldn't be more than 20. "Captain Weiss." "Ma'am. This is an unauthorized departure. You are not cleared for takeoff. The general will." "Sometimes you don't need clearance, son. You just need a reason," she replied, her tone still quiet but carrying an unmistakable finality. "And my reason is waiting out there. You can tell the general he can have my wings when I get back. If I get back." Weiss out. With a flick of a switch, she cut the main radio channel. Silence. Down below, the 4 Allison turboprop engines began to wake up. Not with the high-pitched whine of a modern jet, but with a deep, guttural cough, a plume of smoke, and then a thunderous roar that vibrated through the entire hangar. A few mechanics on their break looked up, startled. A passing officer's eyes went wide. He raised a hand as if to shout, but no one dared to step in her way. They all knew Captain Weiss. When her mind was made up, the chain of command became a suggestion. Slowly, Eleanor rolled out of the hangar and into the Alaskan night. The runway glistened, a black, wet ribbon whose lights faded into the misty distance. The aircraft felt heavy, lumbering like an old beast of burden. But as Lara pushed the throttles forward, she felt that familiar surge of power, a deep vibration that resonated in her bones. The roar intensified, and then, with a grace that belied its age and bulk, the Hercules lifted off the ground. The wheels left the wet concrete, retracting with a heavy clunk. The lights of the base dwindled below, swallowed by the gray. Up there, between the dense walls of cloud and the ever-present electromagnetic static, Lara was alone. The world shrank to the confines of the cockpit. No GPS. No satellite link. No reassuring voice from ATC. Just the howl of the wind over the fuselage, the constant, steady tremor of the wings, and the rhythmic, almost meditative click of the mechanical altimeter. It was the solitude of the long-haul pilot, an emptiness she knew well and in a strange way cherished. She had flown alone before. Over the deserts of the Middle East, over the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. Tonight was no different. Just colder. And lonelier. She broke through the first layer of clouds and for a moment, the world opened up. Above her, the heavens were a sea of brilliant, diamond-hard stars. The Big Dipper. Cassiopeia. Polaris, the North Star. Her true navigators. She flew by them as mariners had for millennia. She cross-referenced their position with the shape of the coastline, a jagged silhouette she had studied on maps until it was burned into her memory. The curve of Bristol Bay, the string of islands that formed the Aleutian chain. She wasn't flying by sight alone. She was flying by the feel of the yoke in her hands as a gust of wind tried to push her off course. She was flying by ear, listening for the slightest change in the harmony of the four engines. Her eyes were fixed on the old whiskey compass. Its needle trembled and danced erratically, driven mad by the solar storm, but it always fought its way back to an approximate north. It wasn't perfect. It was an art of estimation, intuition, and raw experience. But it was enough. An hour passed. Then two. The monotony was a trap, and fatigue was a patient predator. She fought it off with sips of lukewarm water from her canteen. In these moments she thought of her grandmother, Eleanor. She pictured her in a crowded soup kitchen, calmly serving stew while the world outside fell apart. Sometimes, kiddo, she had once told Lara, the most important thing is just to keep moving. One foot in front of the other. One stitch at a time. One breath after another. The rest will sort itself out. Here, in this vibrating cockpit, Lara understood. One gauge check after another. One course correction after another. Suddenly, a shudder. The number 3 engine sputtered. Icing. A problem modern planes would detect and handle automatically. In Eleanor, you had to feel it coming. Lara's reaction was instinctual. She activated the de-icing systems for the wings and props, adjusted her altitude, nudging the old bird into a slightly warmer layer of air. The sputtering stopped, replaced by the steady, reassuring drone. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This was the dance. The constant, living dialogue between pilot and machine. 3 hours had passed. The fuel gauges were dipping dangerously low. The margin for the return trip was razor thin. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. Had she miscalculated? Was she lost in this infinite, roaring darkness? The sea below was a void. No moon, no ships. Just black, angry water. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, maybe a trick of a tired eye. She blinked hard. No, there it was again. Lights. Faint, unsteady beacons blinking out a desperate pattern. It wasn't an airfield. It was the headlights of 2 snowcats and a line of flares stuck in the snow. An emergency runway. A cluster of tents hunkered down against the wind, a makeshift antenna and mud. And between the lights, tiny figures. Men and women in heavy parkas, their faces turned to the sky, full of a hope they had almost lost. A wave of profound relief washed over Lara. She had found them. Now for the hard part. With a grace and precision no one would have thought possible from the old plane, she began her final approach. No instrument landing system, no guidance from the ground. Just her eyes, her feel for the aircraft, and her unwavering trust in Eleanor. A vicious crosswind battered the plane. She fought it with the rudder, her feet dancing on the pedals, keeping the nose perfectly aligned with the flickering flares. The tires screamed as they hit the icy makeshift runway. The Hercules skidded, bucked, but she held it straight. It came to a stop just feet from the edge of the cleared area. For a moment, The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engines and the howl of the Arctic wind. Then, with a loud hydraulic hiss, the rear cargo ramp lowered, revealing its precious contents. There was no applause. The men and women on the ground were too stunned, too relieved for that. Just silent, awestruck gazes. And then hands. Dozens of hands, immediately moving to unload the crates from the belly of the plane. Medicine, water, food, batteries, hope packed in wooden crates. A young Air Force medic, his face pale and chapped from the cold, paused and looked up at her as she climbed down from the cockpit. He whispered, his voice almost stolen by the wind, We thought you weren't coming. We were out of time." Lara just shrugged, a small, almost dismissive gesture. She pulled her hood tighter around her face. "I was always on my way," she said quietly. "You were just too far out to hear me." 2 hours later, the cargo hold empty and her tanks partially refilled with the outpost's last emergency reserves, Eleanor was back in the air. The return flight was just as silent, just as lonely. But this time she was flying into the dawn. A brilliant crimson streak on the eastern horizon, setting the underside of the clouds on fire. Her arrival back at J-Bear was surreal. No reception, no official debrief. Just Hangar 12, waiting to welcome its resident back into its dusty embrace. She ran through the shutdown sequence. The roar of the engines died, leaving a profound ringing silence. She sat for a long moment in the dark cockpit, her hands resting on the cold yoke. She patted the instrument panel. "Good job, Eleanor." The next morning, a strange mood hung over the command building. Rumors were flying. The general was furious, but it was an impotent fury. A court-martial for insubordination was on the table. But at the same time, an unofficial message had been relayed from the Aleutian outpost. Supplies received. Morale restored. An unknown angel found us in the storm. No one knew how to write the official report. A successful, unauthorized mission didn't fit into any regulation. Then around noon someone saw the note. It was stuck to the glass door of the command center with a piece of tape. A simple yellow sticky note, with a message written in thick black marker. Operation Whiteout, complete. No clearance. No excuses. Just results. There was no name signed beneath it. No rank. But everyone who read it, from the lowest airman to the general himself, knew exactly who it was from. Captain Lara Weiss. The pilot no one had on their radar. But the one who reached everyone who needed her.